All right. Thank you again for joining me, Vince. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And we are now live. Thank you, everyone, for joining this episode of Mental Wealth Wednesday. We are honoring and cherishing and celebrating Black History Month. And as I do with most all of my posts, hashtag 365 Black History, because Black history is not limited to just the month of February. We celebrate it intentionally during the month of February because this is when Dr. Carter G. Woodson created Negro History Week, and that was to celebrate the birthdays of Frederick Douglass as well as the president. And so it had later been expanded to celebrate during the whole month under President Jimmy Carter. So we are here today in 2025 celebrating Black history. For some, it is so very important and significant that we amplify the voices of Black people throughout the diaspora, as well as all of their inventions, creations, and contributions to this world. And I'm honored today to have Mr. Vince Curry from Akron, Ohio, with Fair Housing Advocates to talk to us today about fair housing. A lot of us may only hear about that in April. Many of us may not understand how it applies to our daily lives or the lives of our loved ones or someone that we know in our community. We're going to talk a little bit about the significance of civil rights acts, the movement, the laws, and how they're implemented or not implemented. So today we are joined by Mr. Vince Curry. Vince, thank you so much for taking time out of your very, 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 very busy schedule today. Please say hello. Tell us a little bit about you.
Hello. Definitely appreciate you having me on to talk about one of my favorite subjects. I have been involved in the area of housing for over 25 years. I used to be a certified public housing manager. I've had family members who've been managers of rental property, and I've been in the fair housing field for quite a while. So I come from a very diverse background, but it's primarily been in the area of housing. The organization that I'm the head of, Fair Housing Advocates Association, we provide assistance to individuals all over the state. We assist people in locating housing and finding housing, but we also want to make sure that housing that we are referring them to is not engaged in any type of discriminatory practices that would violate the Fair Housing Act. So we do that. We have education programs, we have enforcement programs, but we want to make sure that both landlords and tenants and the general public are aware of their rights and responsibilities. I have served on various boards. For several years, I have served on the board of the National Fair Housing Alliance, which is based in Washington, D.C. I am presently serving as chair of the board. My colleagues have faith in me. And so I've been involved with that. And I've served on boards locally. In my spare time, I do mentor the future, our young people. And I do get enjoyment out of that. It's frustrating at times, but, I love them. And so we want to help them be all that they can be.
Well, that sounds like a very, very busy schedule, in addition to your personal life and the personal caregiving that you provide. But Vince, I do, again, appreciate you coming on to just shed light. And some people may not even know they're in darkness in terms of knowing about the Fair Housing Act and how it applies in our daily lives. You mentioned renting, right? Or even public housing.
Yes.
With renting in the public housing space, in the private market. How does fair housing apply to our lease, to our choice in purchasing a home?
I'm glad you mentioned the different types of housing, public, private, public housing, because oftentimes housing providers often think unless they're dealing with public housing through HUD or the government, that they're not covered by the Fair Housing Act. Fair Housing Act has been in place since 1968. It was passed on April the 11th, 1968, exactly a week after Dr. King was assassinated. Originally, there were protected classes of race, color, religion, and national origin. Those were the protected classes that the government said you cannot be subjected to discrimination on the basis of that protected class. In 1974, sex was added because prior to that time, you as a woman, if you walked into a bank to get a loan and you did not have a husband, you didn't have a man, they would say, sorry, ma'am, we cannot give you a loan because you are not married and you don't have a man. So in 1974, they added sex as a protected class. And then in 1988, the Fair Housing Act was amended to add families with children and individuals with disabilities, particularly physical disabilities and emotional disabilities. And there were some requirements that go along with that were very unique to that protected class. And specifically, in terms of individuals with disabilities, landlords, housing providers, condo associations, public housing authorities, etc., have to make what we call reasonable accommodations for persons with disabilities. And what is a reasonable accommodation? It's an exception or a waiving of a rule that's going to provide a person with a disability an equal opportunity to use and enjoy that housing. So we have reasonable accommodations. Then the law also stated that housing providers have to make what we allow reasonable modifications. That might include installing a wheelchair ramp for somebody that's in a wheelchair. That might include widening a doorway. It may include installing grab bars in a bathroom for somebody who's physically disabled. So the Fair Housing Act has been around since 1968. It's probably, I consider it one of the best laws on the books to help people protect their rights. Housing is that key place that impacts everything in our lives, and it impacts how we perform on our jobs. It impacts our education, where you live. The school that you go to is impacted by that. Our health is impacted by where we live. And so the Fair Housing Act is a very important tool that impacts the lives of everyday Americans. Many times when I go to speak, usually if I speak in a community that doesn't have a lot of Black folks, they'll say, isn't fair housing just for Black folks? It's like, no. Are you disabled? Yes, you're covered. If you have kids, you're covered. If you're a female, whether you're white, Black, Hispanic, etc., if you are subjected to sexual harassment, you're covered. And so one of the goals that I have is to let folks know that this Fair Housing Act impacts every American. In fact, the preamble to the Fair Housing Amendments Act says it is the policy of the United States to provide for fair housing throughout the United States. And so the work that myself and my colleagues across the country, the work that we do, we are supporting the policies of this country.
Thank you for that explanation, and especially tying in our daily lives and how our daily lives are impacted by and protected by the Fair Housing Act. And when I say our daily lives, we have talked about the different types of housing, whether it's renting or purchasing. So you talked a little bit about the renting. For the purchasing side of it. How does that impact a person? And a lot of people who think that this is just applicable to Black families or Black individuals, how would it impact a white family?
If a white family is moving into a community and they encounter some type of resistance to their moving into that community based upon their race, that would be activity that could be a problem. Or if they are, for example, buying a condominium, and they have a child or somebody in the household that is disabled, and the condo association has a rule that says you can't have any pets in this condo. Or if you do have an animal, it has to be a little Chihuahua, Yo Quiero Taco Bell type of animal, or it can't be a certain breed. Well, in those particular situations, when an animal relates to a disability, landlords have to waive those pet policies. So even if they have a no pet policy, if that family provides documentation from a doctor that says that there's a relationship between this person's disability and this animal, for example, it might be depression, and the animal helps to ameliorate or reduce the impact of this person's emotional disability, then the condo association has to waive the no pet rule, waive the breed restriction rule, waive the weight restriction rule, and allow that family to have that companion animal or therapy animal or ESA.
How
Right?
about the deposit?
Huh?
How about the deposit? Do they have to pay a pet deposit?
I'm glad you said that, because I have a case right now where they're trying to charge fees based upon the presence of a therapy animal. Animals that relate to disabilities, whether it's an ESA, whether it might be a cat, or any animal that relates to a disability, the landlords cannot charge deposits or fees related to those particular service and or therapy animals. So that's a case where a family might encounter. In fact, most of my cases right now, keeping it real, I'm going to say probably 80% relate to disabilities, mental and or physical.
Mm-hmm. That's good to know. And also just a technical issue that turns into a legal issue.
Mhm.
Pet versus animal.
Mhm.
So pet, prior to no disability, no reasonable accommodation request involved with the situation. If it's a pet not related to a disability, then you are subject to pet deposit,
Yes.
or when there's no pets allowed,
Yes.
things of that nature. Where it becomes an issue and a significant legal difference is when there is a reasonable accommodation
Yes.
related to a disability. You no longer call that animal a pet. It is now an animal.
Yes. And that's
subject to different things.
Yeah, that's I tell landlords. I said, now, if little Felix here, the cat, if it's just if he's there because the person is likes cats and has nothing to do with a disability, that's a pet. But if Felix is there because a person has an emotional impairment, an emotional disability, then that's a therapy companion animal, etc. And you cannot charge or do anything like that. Apply any restrictions on that in terms of breed and weight. So yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this, because a lot of people get confused. And the other thing I do want to mention, that when those housing providers, they have a right to verify the need for that ESA, but they don't have a right to know what the disability is.
Correct.
And
Okay.
landlords want to know, well, what is the disability? Or, well, you don't look disabled. Don't make those statements, because you're digging yourself a hole.
Tell us, what is ESA?
Emotional support animal.
Okay, so how is that different than flying? Like, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. How is that different than the Fair Housing Act in terms of an animal or a pet?
Well, I'm going to say this. I'm going to stick to my area of expertise, and that's fair housing. But I do that does come up from time to time, and I tell housing providers that ADA is slightly different than the Fair Housing Act, and so there's some nuances under that may not actually apply to the Fair Housing Act.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, don't listen to other laws, because sometimes it says here I can do that. I said, but there's two different laws, and so you're not covered. You're not a public entity. You're a private landlord providing housing, so you're covered by the Fair Housing Act. Now, if you have some properties that are HUD subsidized, because we have some providers I'm throughout the state, and so sometimes we'll have cases where it's a private landlord, but their building is subsidized through HUD. They're covered also by Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which protects people with disabilities as well. But that ADA thing is not applicable to fair housing, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that comes up occasionally.
Yeah, I can see that, but especially in terms of ESA.
Yes.
Because with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the animal has to be trained to assist with your specific disability, whereas that's not required with the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah, so if I have an animal because my doctor prescribes it, it's not trained to do anything. It's going to pet. It's going to purr. It's going to be with me. So there's no training. But if it's a service animal, and that's a distinction. A service animal performs some type of service that's connected to my disability. I might suffer from seizures, and the animal can calm me down and comfort me, or sense when I'm about to have a seizure. I know there are some animals that are trained to go pick things up. for people who have mobility or are paralyzed and things of that nature. So again, if it's a service animal, the distinction is it has to be trained to provide some type of service that's connected to the individual's disability. If
But
it
with fair housing, you don't have to prove or show that. Is that correct?
Say that again. I'm
With
sorry.
fair housing, you don't have to prove or show that your animal is a service animal or a emotional support animal or a companion animal, just that it's related to your disability, or do you have to show?
If it's a service animal, you need to show because you're saying it's a service animal, and the landlord has a right to verify that. So if you're saying I have this animal because of physical impairments that it might be, again, it might be seizures.
Mm-hmm.
The animal, let's say it's a monkey, and the monkey
Mm-hmm.
goes and performs certain things for you. You have to show that you have to provide documentation that shows that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad some landlords are requiring that landlords be, I mean, not landlords, that service animals be and ESAs be certified. So you got these companies out here that are charging people with disabilities all kinds of ridiculous fees.
But
To,
the law doesn't require that.
no,
Yeah.
no, no.
Okay.
But the law only allows the landlord to ask the tenant to show that there's a nexus between their disability and this animal. And if it's a service animal, that this animal provides the service connected to the disability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that distinction. It can get tricky,
Yes.
and it's important to be able to have someone to consult with. If you need an animal, a companion animal, someone, an animal that helps you with your emotional stability, it's important to be able to understand and know that,
Yes.
and be able to have someone to advocate on your behalf.
Yeah. And I want landlords to know, sometimes landlords want to do it, but they're concerned about what the other tenants in the building are going to say. And they say, well, I got to tell them. I said, no, you cannot tell them that this person has this animal because of a disability. And
Mm-hmm.
you just say, I'm handling my business the way I'm supposed to, and leave it at
Yeah.
another thing
What
that
if it's a condo association and the board members want to know?
and I have a case like that right now, and I'm dealing with them because they want all this tenants information, and they're going to talk about it in the meeting. You can't. That's private information. You should not
Medical information.
medical information. So that's the other thing, because sometimes landlords, when they ask the tenant to sign this form, the form is sometimes too broad. They want information on every disability or impairment that this person has or has ever had.
Mm-hmm.
Can't do that. You can only ask for information that verifies that this person has a disability and that there's a nexus between that disability and what they're asking for. And they provide that. You should go ahead and approve that accommodation. Now, there are times that you don't have to approve the accommodation if the tenant can't provide information that shows the nexus between. They got to be disabled, first of all. If they can't provide that, or disability, or they're perceived as being disabled, then some of those other steps aren't. You're not able to get there. And there's one other thing I wanted to say about disabilities is when you do get that information, you want to keep it locked up somewhere, so
Confidential. Yeah.
confidential, so everybody does not have access to it.
Thank you. Those are great tips. I hope that those who are property owners, home providers, housing providers are aware of the responsibilities that they have in terms of reasonable accommodations and being prepared for addressing those requests when they come in, and just ultimately knowing what your residents' fair housing rights are. And this is also for those of us who are residents or home seekers, home buyers, that you understand and know what your fair housing rights are. So, as Vince indicated, 1968, the Fair Housing Act was enacted, signed by Lyndon B. Johnson after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April of
Yeah.
1968, and amended twice, as Vince pointed out. So, Vince, we're now in 2025. Why do we need the Fair Housing Act? How is it helping us today?
It's helping people Sadly, we need it because we still, whether we want to admit it or not, we still
No,
have.
we don't.
We do.
Critics would say we don't need it. What do
Well,
you tell them, Vince?
it gives people a right to live where they want to live. It
Mm-hmm.
protects them from adverse actions that they might receive from individuals who may not want them there. It provides them equal opportunity. For example, we're talking about the people with disabilities. So it's needed, and the struggle now is there are times that the times that we are in now. Um, it seems like the agencies that used to be our partners in protecting people's fair housing and civil rights, um, it's not where it should be. And it seems like we're moving backwards. And so some of my clients who we filed complaints with, say, some of the state organizations, and several of them have said to me, why do I feel like I was wrong for complaining about being discriminated against? People that are supposed to be helping me make me feel like I'm wrong. And so we're fighting an uphill battle, not only on the national level, but also in the state of Ohio. But the Fair Housing Act is needed because guess what? Everybody needs a place to live. And so it's important that we have some laws in place. And think about it. I do want to say this. Without getting political, I do want to say that when the act was amended in 1988 to add families with kids and persons with disabilities, that law was signed by Ronald Reagan, a Republican who recognized that it's important to protect people's fair housing rights. And not only did the law expand the protected classes to give us 7, but it also gave the federal government the responsibility to protect people's fair housing rights as well. And so you could actually file complaints. We had a law with some teeth. File complaints with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, with their FHEO division. They would investigate the complaints. If there was merit to it, sometimes those complaints settled, sometimes they didn't. And so they would end up either before a HUD ALJ or actually being filed by the Department of Justice in a federal court action. And so, or if the state, such as Ohio, has an equivalent law, then HUD would partner with that state agency, such as the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, and they, on behalf of HUD, would take those complaints. And so that was that government
dual jurisdiction between the two entities.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so the amendments of 1988 really gave some teeth to the law, because prior to that, it was just a paper tiger. And it allowed people to be able to file complaints, not only get the housing, but they're entitled to get money. Landlords have to change their policies. And so that's where we are now. But again, as I said a few moments ago, we're getting a lot of resistance from the very individuals that are supposed to be helping us to protect people's fair housing rights.
So it's almost like, what's the point of having a law if you can't have it enforced?
Yes.
So what can we do about that?
I think we have to push back. Number one, I think you have to let your senators and your Congress people know. Like I got a complaint a few weeks ago from a family who lives in Copley. Their mortgage company is doing some strange things, and normally I would refer those to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because they handle mortgage issues as well. But now I can't, because that agency's head is gone and it's not functioning, and the president that we have now is trying to shut it down. So here you see that was helping everyday folks, because everybody can't afford a lawyer.
Right.
You know what lawyers charge out there. Y'all ain't cheap. And so everybody can't afford that. So the federal government became the voice. Once the evidence was there, they would do the investigation. And there were people being harmed by mortgage companies and banks. And the CFPB was righting those wrongs. But now that's not happening.
And you may not even be able to have recourse filing a fair housing complaint, because fair housing covers transactions for housing as well, correct?
Yes, there's lending. Yeah, lending is covered. Yeah, under fair, we have fair housing, fair lending laws. But again, you have to have resources. We both know that in this company, in this country, rather, if you don't have the resource, how far you go is based on your resources. So if I'm a single dad or a struggling parent or just a single person, do I have $1,000 to give to a lawyer?
Mm.
It costs $500 just to file a case in federal court.
Mm.
So everybody doesn't have the resources. And so the state agencies and the federal agencies, the administrative process was so critical for helping folks, everyday folks who may not be able to afford a lawyer. And you may live in a community. Yeah, think about some of the rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
I got colleagues in South Dakota, Montana. It's a lot of land, but few people. And so you may not actually have have attorneys there who have the skill to be able to even handle a fair housing complaint. But yet, if you could file that complaint with HUD or a FAP agency, there's a shot to get a resolution and to right a wrong and to get people into the housing that they want, etc.
So what is a FAP agency?
A FAP agency, back under President Reagan, there was a program called FIP, Fair Housing Initiatives Program, where the federal government agreed to fund private nonprofits across the country to provide assistance to individuals, the general public, et cetera, on fair housing rights and responsibilities. There was not only enforcement, but there was education. Now, the FAP is the Fair Housing Assistance Program, where HUD partners with a state agency such as the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, and that state agency will investigate and process fair housing complaints on behalf of HUD, as HUD would. That was always one of the issues we had here too, because sometimes the Civil Rights Commission would say, well, this is how we see it, and we will often push back and say, but nah, under that FAP agreement, the memorandum of understanding of the memorandum you all have to implement the law as HUD would. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there was a breakdown and there were arguments on that, but a FAP agency processes complaints on behalf of HUD.
Wow. So there are various organizations from the federal to the state to the local level that are in place to help facilitate people having their rights enforced,
yes,
having their rights protected.
Yes.
So whether it's a FIP, a FAP, HUD directly, or a state agency that may be a FAP, there were various avenues to try to have your rights protected.
I'm glad you said were, because that's where we are right now. Keeping it real, because this administration, the president that we have, wants to cut things, and HUD, they want to cut HUD funding. That's going to impact
staff.
And staff, yes. We already didn't have enough people in the FHEO division. And
what is the FHEO?
It's the Fair Housing Equal Opportunity Division at HUD. HUD has many divisions. There's a part of HUD that provides housing, but there's a part of HUD that wants to make sure that the people who are securing their housing are not encountering discrimination. And they also monitor housing authorities, et cetera. But right now, a lot of fair housing assistance in this country is at risk, because under the FIP program, there are groups spread throughout this country who are providing assistance every day to single moms, to disabled people, to veterans, who they're not going to get that assistance because the Elon Musk in the Department of Doge has frozen FIP funds that have already been approved and appropriated by Congress.
And there is a partnership, an agreement, and even by statute for VASH, the Veterans Assistance Program, for housing. And there's specific vouchers between the Veterans Administration and the Department of Housing and Urban Development to provide these special vouchers for veterans.
Yes.
So those are potentially at risk as well.
Yes. Vouchers. Listen, I've been telling people if the cuts go through now, hopefully, the money that's already been approved and appropriated gets to the people it's supposed to get to, because Congress controls the purse under the Constitution. And I know there may be some cuts coming down the road on future funding. We've always kind of that's been there all the time. but we still need to make sure that we have this funding so we can provide assistance to folks. Because in a tight housing market, discrimination and harassment goes up. Like during COVID, when the housing crisis, there were a lot of single women encountering sexual harassment.
Quid pro quo.
Yes.
Tell us an example, because people don't seem to get what that is. And I'm so glad you brought this up, Vince, because there was a comedian who posted a reel, and anybody watching it, perhaps I looked at it, with my legal eye, and I had to comment, because although it was intended to be funny, it may be a situation that's common and it's just known that this is what you're supposed to do. It's illegal. And the situation was a landlord, and it was time for rent. And the two female roommates were fighting over who was going to have to do something with the landlord, because rent was short. The rent money wasn't there.
Yes.
And so it's a common thing, I think, in some regard, that it's a possibility that you might be in that type of situation. Yes. But what may not be so common is knowing that it's illegal and that you do not have to do it. Yes. And if you are in the situation, that you don't have to continue to do it.
Yeah. We've had several cases where women have encountered sexual harassment, both types, the quid pro quo, this for that. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. Or just a hostile environment where the guy is just making all kinds of statements. Hey, I want to have sex with you. I had a case where he told her PUSSY was his and she couldn't do anything about it. When she would go to the office to do things, he would put porno on. It was bad. Mm-hmm. In fact, also he wouldn't, her door lock on her door it wasn't as strong as it should have been, and he wouldn't fix it. She had to sleep with her couch in front of the door. That women encounter that. Oftentimes single women with kids. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they do that because the alternative is homelessness, and they do it because they're trying to protect their kids. In those type of cases, in that particular case, sometimes it's difficult to get evidence, because guess what? They only do it when nobody's around. So in that particular case, we were able, she wore a tape recorder, and he made a bunch of statements that we were able to use in trial. But they are often, women are traumatized when they encounter that. And sometimes we've had one where the lady said, I don't want to have sex with him anymore. I know I shouldn't have, and I want to stop, but he doesn't want me to stop. And he's threatening to put me out if I stop. So these are unique situations that still happen every day, but they can be fought. But we have to make sure we're able to gather some evidence. And sometimes we can't, and it comes down to the credibility of the individuals. And we've had a few cases where some of the landlords did not want to go forward, and they settled, and we got things resolved. But it's a case by case basis. But you can fight sexual harassment and win. No one will encounter that.
I appreciate you explaining that. And just for our viewers to know, it's not necessarily always a woman who is subject to this type of behavior. It could be men, just like our another law we're not going to go into depth about tonight, but the Violence Against Women's Act, because that does play into fair housing and opportunities to live without being subject to harm from someone that may have had you in an abusive situation, financially, physically, emotionally, and otherwise. But I just want to say for the viewers, because I mentioned VASH and I didn't say the whole acronym, that is the Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program. And that is by law a joint program between the Veterans Administration and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So you may have heard about VASH providing vouchers, assistance, financial assistance for veterans. And that is another way, unfortunately, that people could be discriminated against, because the vouchers may not be accepted by the property owner. And while veteran status, and you could correct me, Vince, while veteran status is not a protected class on the federal level,
correct,
locally, whether it's by the state or a municipality, its governing body, i.e. city council or state legislators, may have added that as a protected class.
Yes.
So make sure you check in your area what your state or city has as protected classes as it relates to fair housing. And just as a sidebar, for equal employment opportunity as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I often tell landlords um, who have properties in different cities. I said, guess what? Each of those cities can have a different fair housing law
Mm-hmm.
that has different protected classes. Like in DC, I know you all's fair housing law has political affiliation attached to it. Uh,
That's important.
yeah,
Depending on the jurisdiction, those types of things are
yeah,
important
yeah,
because, and students, being a student.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Because if you live in an area like Bowling Green, Ohio, it was known to be, like a college town. So mostly it's just students that are living out in the community, and they could be subject to discrimination.
yeah,
Property owners that don't want to rent to students because they're rowdy or whatever the situation is. So,
what I found with students, oftentimes, if there's discrimination against students, it's against um, males.
oh, I was going to say international students, but
Well,
okay.
they do that. The international students, they do take advantage of them, and because they're from a different country and they don't know all the rights. In fact, at the University of Akron, I used to do every year. I did a fair housing presentation to the international students, and that was eventually scooted out the door because there were some folks there who didn't want them to know what their rights were.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well, that's why we're here tonight.
Yes.
We are letting people know what their rights are as it relates to fair housing. And Vince has a long-standing successful career in advocating for individuals. And specifically, Vince, I truly appreciate your work in the disability space for mental health disabilities. And I would just be remiss if I did not introduce that as a part of our discussion tonight. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's wonderful for people to be able to speak up for themselves, to find out how they can make sure they have their animal when they move. For example, maybe one property owner allowed for them to have the animal, no questions asked or whatever, but now they're moving and this new one says no pets, and being able to understand pet versus animal, and that if it's related to a disability, you can ask for a reasonable accommodation request. But Vince,
Mm-hmm.
with mental health issues, people who are maybe dealing with anosognosia and don't even know they're sick, but others um, perceive them. That
Yeah.
was a word that you used early. Perceive them to be,
Yeah.
or they have a record of,
Or they have
as a part of the definition, the
yeah.
legal definition of disability.
Yeah.
How do you handle those types of cases? How do you even find out about those cases if a person is not able to communicate that need, or even knowing that they're being discriminated against?
I will say this: I have been blessed to be pretty good at what I do, and so word of mouth. And so when you help one person, they tell so and so. Or I have good relation. I have formed relationships with several of the agencies that provide mental support. For example, like community support services here, Coleman, various agencies that I've worked with, and so they know if they have an issue, they can pick up the phone and I will try to provide assistance. But I'm glad you mentioned that sometimes they don't even know, because I had a case, a client who she lived in public housing, and prior to her being diagnosed, she had become unstable
Mm.
and made some statements to some of the housing authority staff. And so when she reapplied, they held those statements against her.
Mm.
And I had to explain to them. I said, yes, she had engaged in some unique behavior that we would not want her to engage in, but that was before she was diagnosed, and she's now in treatment, on medication. She has a caseworker and she has a counselor.
Mm.
So the accommodation was to not use that information because she didn't know what she had. She didn't know what she was going through, but now she's stable and undergoing treatment. And so they fought me on that, but they eventually granted the accommodation and rehoused her. So that's a unique, that happens. And oftentimes I had one, what's crazy is when I used to be a public housing manager, and I didn't know anything about fair housing. They hadn't trained us on this. And so I remember I had a gentleman who had stopped taking his medicine. and had become unstable. He had put his television in his window, and he came in the office one day and said, because the apartment complex that I managed was on a lake, and he said, "Where is the boat that you promised me?" I said, "Sir, I didn't. In fact, I was not your manager when you moved in here. But who promised you a boat?" He said, "Well, he said the previous manager had promised him A, B, C, D, E, F, G." Well, I could see that he was becoming unstable, so I didn't want to evict him, even though the people in his building they were concerned about his behavior. So I just picked up the phone and called. I went through his file and found the number of his mom and said, "Hey, this is the situation. Can you help me? Because I don't want to evict him."
Mm-hmm.
He got him back on his medication and everything was okay. But that was just out of the goodness of my heart that I did that. Now knowing what I know now. And so I often that's why it's important for housing providers to know their rights and responsibilities. Now, I didn't have to do anything until that person asked for the accommodation. I just did it though, because I was trying to help. But there are times when housing providers have to make exceptions. Even though your normal process might be to evict, if there is an accommodation that can reduce that least violating behavior from happening again, then you have to grant that accommodation. Now, if the person is a direct threat to the health and safety of others, then you may not have to grant the accommodation. But if they're not, then you do have to grant it. So I don't want landlords to think that you have to grant it under every circumstance. No.
Or just automatically assuming that the person is a risk to the health and safety of others because they're being perceived as being potentially exhibiting the types of behaviors that may impact other people.
I see people all the time that as Sinbad would say, they're working through some issues, but they're not a direct threat to anybody. Right. If they're talking to, listen, I talk to myself sometimes. Nobody sees it, but
there was a song about it.
Right.
I talk to myself.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Even if somebody has unique behaviors that go along with their disability, if they're not a direct threat to the health and safety of anybody, leave them alone.
Right.
But sometimes people try to pick at people and trigger them. And so I've had to step in and say, no, they're trying to trigger this person with the disabilities. So they go off and do this. So you all can try to get them out. No, we're not. We're going to fight that. And so we're pretty successful most of the time. We don't win every case, but we fight hard. And we've been pretty successful for the most part in helping people. Because what we don't understand is that person, if you throw them out there into the streets, they're going to become more unstable.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can get them some help, keep them in the housing, get them on some medication, get them in counseling. I even had one case where the doctor changed the medication and the person became unstable. So I was able to use that. The doctor said, yeah, I did change the medication. I see it didn't work. And so when I went to the landlord and said, hey, would you, he's going back to the original medication and everything should be okay. Would you grant the accommodation and rescind the notice of termination? And they did that. And that's fine.
That's good when you have collaborative partners, even the housing provider. Some are just resistant and don't care what information you provide or, support, verification and otherwise. And so when you're able to have a collaborative system of support, it can make it a smoother process and just ultimately helping someone who needs to be housed. Right?
That's why we need the federal government to provide the funding to the people, because them being homeless creates a whole another problem.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can keep them stable, keep them in housing, and where they enjoy the benefit of that, that's what we want to do.
But and not just the funding, but the enforcement.
Yes. So right now,
enforcement is critical.
Yes. Because we've had some landlords who have said, we don't give a care what the law says. Mm-hmm. Or they say, I did this because my attorney told me I could. Well, your attorney gave you bad advice. Mm-hmm. And so enforcement, education and enforcement are key. We need both of those. We do education, whether it be articles, seminars, workshops at libraries, things such as what we're doing tonight to help educate folks. But we also have to have the enforcement mechanism as well.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those.
Very, very, very important. So Vince, you mentioned word of mouth and relationships with organizations. For a person who is just starting their career in housing, like you, when you became a housing manager, or a family
So
member.
listen, I didn't know I was going to be doing this. If I did, I would have gone to law school. So I'm going to tell you that now. If I knew I was going to end up doing this, I would have definitely gone on to law school. But
It's not too late.
I know, but listen,
Law school only 3 years.
Huh?
Law school is only 3 years.
No, you gotta have the resources. And now, wait a minute, there used to be minority scholarships, but those have been so slowly whittled away. It's crazy. But I would, you gotta have a passion for this work because you're gonna get beat up. You're gonna get talked about. You gotta know who you are, and you have to know that you've been called to this. This for me is a calling. I could be doing much better. No, I'm not going to say better. How do I say this? Things that would not have caused me to get beat up like I do. That's what I mean. But it's a calling, and you got to be, and people need an advocate. We all need somebody on our side.
Right.
That's what bothers me. There's a lot of folks, the people with the money have the lawyers. What about the everyday? What about the 65-year-old woman who has nobody, who's getting dementia and who needs some assistance? She can live by herself, but she needs some support and some help.
Right.
What about the person in the wheelchair who moved into this apartment where they weren't in a wheelchair then, but now they are? They may need to, because of an accident or because of an illness, they can't do steps anymore.
Yeah.
And so they need to break that leash, because to go up and down those steps where the bathroom is hell for them because they got physical impairments. And so they need somebody to be a voice. And whether it's me, whether it's you, whoever, but people need advocates to speak for them, because everybody can't, and they don't know how to articulate it. And they don't always know your rights. I got a client who is a former police officer and was chasing somebody and jumped over a fence, but hit his head and now has a lot of pain, messed up vertebrae. Well, he had filed a complaint with the Civil Rights Commission, and they asked him for some information, and he gave them all of his medical information, which lumbar, which C, whatever. I'm like, guy, you didn't have to, that's too much information. So sometimes people don't know what their rights are. So it's important that they have folks like us out there to help to walk with them through this process as well. I got a unique case, HIV. A lot of people don't know that's a disability. This gentleman had gotten sick, had moved into a rehab facility, got well, and was about to move into an independent living facility down in Mount Vernon, Ohio. They approved him. His daughter paid his $100 fee for his apartment. They had put up his name. He had a name plate, and they allowed the daughter to go in and measure the apartment for a refrigerator that was going to be delivered for him. Everything was okay until they got the records from the rehab center that said HIV. And then after that, we're sorry, something came up. So that kind of stuff. So we need agencies and people like me and you and other folks out there to be able to fight and help these folks right the wrong that's been done to them.
Wow. And since you brought up HIV, we talked about VASH, the Veterans program and the vouchers that are associated with that. But there's also specialized vouchers for people living with AIDS.
Yes.
So HOPWA, housing opportunities for people with AIDS. And that's another way, like with this situation, of unlawful discrimination.
Yeah.
Against someone with a disability.
Yeah, that's why source of income, it really should be a protected class at the national level, because the federal government gives money for these vouchers.
People
Landlords
don't want to take them.
don't have to take them.
That's
Now,
right.
luckily, the city of Akron passed a source of income law. And so I've got a couple of clients who are so depressed because, yeah, we're filing complaints and they're selling them, they're getting money, but they want to get a house. And so some of these landlords don't want to take the voucher.
And see, we talked about earlier, you got to make sure you're checking your local jurisdiction, your city, your state, because there may be more protected classes at the local level. So one you just heard, or we talked about earlier, students, that could be a protected class at the local level.
Yeah.
Vince just mentioned the source of income.
And the
veterans, these are additional protected classes, not at the federal level pursuant to the Fair Housing Act, but your local city or state's fair housing law.
Usually your bigger cities, like the city of Columbus. I'm helping a client to find some housing in Columbus, and she has a voucher, and she keeps trying to look outside of the city of Columbus. I said, you can look there, but there's no protection for you there. Because the city of, say, Pickerington, the city of New Albany, though they don't have to, they don't have protection for voucher holders.
Right.
The city of Columbus does. And so if you got the
jurisdiction matters. Yes. That's an important point. That's a very important point.
Yes.
But knowing about that, it's one thing with vouchers, but we talked about earlier, 1988, including families with children. So it's not just the children that you currently have. You could be in the process of getting a child through adoption or otherwise, or pregnancy, right?
Yeah, correct. Foster parents,
right.
Sadly, because of the opioid epidemic, grandmas and grandpas
taking custody of the children.
Yes, having to raise their children. I have a case right now against our housing authority here in Akron, where we had a grandmother who was has a voucher. She had a one-bedroom voucher because she's single, but she got custody of her granddaughters, and the housing authority did not want to give her a bigger voucher so
that she could get a bigger place, more bedrooms. Yeah.
And that's of familial status discrimination.
Right.
Grandmother forced to be because the court gave her custody, so now they eventually did give her a 2-bedroom, but we're fighting them because their policy was you have to have permanent custody of a child, and the Fair Housing Act does not say that.
Right.
Fair Housing Act just says custody, because you can have temporary custody for 6 months, 2 years. Every court decides to because they're hoping that person, whatever happens, gets
reunification. Yeah.
Just to say, so we're fighting that case. So that's a case where a person who would not have been protected is now protected because she's gotten custody of her grandkids. So Fair Housing Act, again,
it encompasses so much, and we just need to understand this is not a race thing. This is a protected class thing. And there are a lot of protected classes, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. So please check your laws. Look for organizations like Vince's with the Fair Housing Advocates Association. There are so many organizations that are there to support, to advocate, and to fight for your rights. And to ensure you know your rights.
And if you're in a state and you don't have a fair housing organization around you, if you call the National Fair Housing Alliance, they will locate somebody that might be closer that's in your state. Sometimes people looking at, well, I live in this city and I can't find anything, but sometimes there's another organization. It might be 3 or 4 hours away, but they still might be able to provide some type of assistance. But if they can't, then we need HUD to be there.
Right. That's important.
Those people's fair housing rights. And that's my fear right now, that without enforcement, the homeless population is going to go up. It's just going to, because already right now we have a housing crisis. That's why I'm struggling even with HUD wanting to cut its funding. We need housing.
Right.
We need money to build affordable housing, and affordable housing does not mean public housing. And so a lot of times people hear that, they think public housing. No, and even with vouchers, it's people who work regular jobs, go to get up and work a 9 to 5 every day who have a voucher. there are bank tellers who have vouchers. And there are in affordable housing, there are folks that are bank tellers, beginning teachers. It's just based on your income isn't high enough, isn't up there
The
yet.
working poor.
Yes. Yes.
The working poor.
Which is the majority of America right through here.
Hey, most anyone
yeah.
is maybe not be able to make it 3 months without a paycheck. Not even 1 month, you know, not a week. And that's the reality that we have to understand that people are living in, people are facing, being totally tapped out, trying to help other family members to stay afloat.
Yes.
Vince, I have to ask you.
What's that?
Before we end, we have known each other for a long time now. As I think about it, I got involved with fair housing when I did not know what it was either, know the significance of it, know how it was connected to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who I always heard about throughout my upbringing and through school.
Right.
But Hurricane Katrina, it was after Hurricane Katrina, I went to my first Fair Housing my first Fair Housing Conference down in New Orleans. And I remember this so vividly because Hurricane Katrina, most anybody can tell you where they were when Hurricane Katrina hit. But afterwards, that conference being down there, and a part of the conference, there was a tour of the areas that were affected by Hurricane Katrina. But that was my introduction to fair housing. And I did not think that I would continue on with fair housing being a part of my career. And here I am 23 years into being a lawyer, and the most of my career has been in housing and development, even helping the city of Canton, Ohio to establish its FAP, which we talked about earlier. And being a tester, I didn't even realize when I was a tester back in college that it was regarding fair housing. I didn't realize that at the time. And that my first housing, upon me being born, was in public housing. And what an honor it was for me to serve as general counsel for the same housing authority that provided housing for me and my mother. But I say all that to say this.
And I know I got on your nerves. You didn't like me.
That's not the truth. I was a collaborative partner.
Yeah, but I knew I was getting on your nerves. Yeah, I could tell when I said I'm getting on her nerves. But
look, whether it was legal aid or a fair housing organization or some other organization that was advocating on behalf of residents, I could do nothing but have respect, because people, like you said, everybody can't afford an attorney, and people's rights need to be abided by. Yeah. So one goal of mine, something that I wanted to ensure, was to know our property managers to understand and know the law in terms of fair housing. And even with sexual harassment, Vince, it's not always the resident that is subject to sexual harassment. The staff can also be subject to sexual harassment, even if they don't, have any interest in the resident and what the resident is trying to propose. They still
I understand
need
that.
to have a situation and know what they're able to do to address that.
I was a public housing manager. I had 3 developments, and 99% of my residents were female. So I fully understand.
Well, it's important as a housing provider that you know what you to do, because look, we could go into a whole nother discussion, but this is what I wanted to get at, and how long I've been involved with this now, and being introduced to you when I was at the city of Canton, because you helped to provide training for tester training.
Right.
But there was a very, very important case that happened in Ohio, and your organization was a part of it. It was a big case, and people may not understand how it's connected to fair housing. So I'm going to say Coal Run, the water case.
Yes.
And those should be the magic words to let you know what I'm talking about. Please tell us a little bit about that case and why it was so significant, and more importantly, how utilities being provided in the area is connected to fair housing opportunities.
That's a case from Muskingum County and the city of Zanesville. When I initially was told about that situation from a colleague, Lisa Rice, who she said she had gotten a call about a community where that was predominantly Black, and they would not give the Black folks water. And there was, particularly on this one street, the white folks lived at the top of the hill and the Black folks lived at the bottom, and the public water stopped where the Black folks' houses began. And I'm thinking, can't be happening in 2000. This is not the 1800s. Lo and behold, when I went down there, sure enough, they did not have public water. This community had what we call cisterns. So imagine this: you live in this area, and you can look next door, and you see your neighbor watering his grass because the city and the county have given them water. And then they're also running water lines through your backyard to other cities 15 and 25 miles away, and you can't get water. And these folks have been trying to get water for about 50 years. And the last
Wait a minute. What? 50?
50.
I'm just making sure the people in the back heard that.
Yes.
50 years, this community, generations.
Yes. Now, there were some white people who didn't get water either because they were mixed in with the Black folks. But for 50 years, and they would go to community meetings and ask, when we going to get water? And the last time they went, before I got involved, Jerry Kennedy, who sadly has passed on, he went to a meeting and he said, we grew up here. In fact, it was generations of the Kennedy family, Bobby Kennedy, Mary Kennedy, but they told him, your grandparents didn't have water. Your parents didn't have water. Your grandkids might get water if you tell President Bush that bin Laden is here and he drops a squirrely bomb in the ground and water comes up. The reason they couldn't drink the water is because of the coal mines. And the water was bad. And so they were drinking water. They would have their water trucked in these cisterns. So to go down there and see sinks that had no faucets, to hear the stories of having to bathe, to share bath water, to women to catch the water off of the roof and then wash their hair in that water, to as a growing up not wanting to invite your friends over to the house because you can't flush the toilet a lot. So growing up without city water, but to see your neighbors building houses and they have city water, and to know that they're sending water 15, 20 miles away.
To other communities.
So let me say this. Under what we call the Community Development Block Grant Program, when HUD gives communities money, there's a responsibility to make sure that money is not used in a discriminatory way. And in this particular case, they were denying this predominantly Black community water while sending water to the predominantly white communities. In fact, they would come, what's crazy about this, they would get because if you have so many low to moderate income folks in your neighborhood, there's certain benefits.
The census tracts.
Yes.
Yeah.
They would come and get these people's income information.
To use it to support the funding.
Yes, but then never give them water. So we had to actually go to court. When I got involved, I started gathering evidence. We had to go house to house, which is kind of scary because we were in these little hollers. I didn't know what hollers were, and so finally I reached out to a firm in DC called the Relman Firm, and John Relman. I sent him a copy of my Civil Rights Commission complaint, and he called me back instantly within 20 minutes and said, this is a very interesting case. He then flew in. I drove down to Zanesville. We met with the folks. He decided they were going to take the case. And in 2004, a lawsuit was filed with about 67 plaintiffs, including my agency. And it went to trial 4 years later in 2008. And the jury came back and said that the city of Zanesville and Muskingum County had engaged in violations of the Fair Housing Act and other anti-discrimination laws. And they really should have been, it should have been, and the jury came back with an award of like $10.9 million. And I mean, they were so, to see people excited
to have justice,
to have justice, but to be excited over getting water.
to
In
get
fact,
water.
one guy, oh shoot, Cindy's dad, Mr. I can't think of what his name was, but Cindy Harrison's dad, he said it felt like a little bit of heaven. To be able to turn on the faucet or take a shower. In fact, we went down there one of my last times, right after the case went to court and they put the water lines in. I went to see one of the elderly clients and I couldn't see her because she was terminally ill. But her granddaughter said, I need to tell you this. My grandma was finally able to take one of those Calgon take me away baths where she could get cancer. She was able to fill the tub up and just lay back
and relax.
Yes, but she couldn't do that before because they had to ration water.
Yes.
One time, one of them drank some of the water and it says it tasted nasty, and they went out and there were 3 dead rats in the cistern. So it wasn't a good situation, but we were able to get justice, and they were happy. They all got water, it's been, in fact, I went down, one of the oldest client that's still alive is 90 years old. And so I was able to go to her birthday party and celebrate her and see some of the folks I hadn't seen in years. So yeah, that was the case that made national news, New York Times, LA Times. But crazy part is I couldn't really get a lot of press here in Ohio. My own, the Beacon Journal.
Where it happened.
Huh? Yeah.
Where it happened.
But that's crazy. It's Ohio sometimes. We're conservative, but it made national news. And so, but I'm happy that we were able to get those folks water, and they were able to get some money for having been denied water for all of those years. The only thing I was upset about was the federal government didn't do anything to them because even though they knew they were intentional denying.
No punitive damages.
No, the government, they continue to give them money after that. And I wasn't saying,
oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, because you all knew, everybody knew about this.
Right.
For years, and they wouldn't do anything about it. And so we did get them water, and the rest is history. So
that's a part of enforcement too, because when they're signing for the funds, they're signing, certifying that they will affirmatively further fair housing. We don't have to have the AFFH rule. It is a part of the Fair Housing Act. And it's unfortunate when, it's kind of like a rock between a rock and a hard place in terms of the need. Like we talked about the housing crisis, right? And you have these housing providers or communities that have the resources that are needed. Right. And with the additional support of the federal government, could do more to help their community. Yes. But to enforce it, i.e. take money back, then that's not helpful either. So it's just being stuck between a rock and a hard place, but still enforcement is absolutely needed. Vince, I truly appreciate you coming on today and talking about the Fair Housing Act. I hope that we can have another conversation and just talk about it even more, especially with the changes that are taking place at the federal level now. So really would like you to come back on and just let us know how things are going and what people can do to help in this situation.
Congressmen, their senators, and complain to them at both the reps at the state level as well as the federal level, and let them know how this is impacting everyday people. I will say this: April is Fair Housing Month, so that might be a time to come back. But again,
we might be able to wait till April. Well, this got to start now, today, because things are being talked about in the news right now today. Right now today, we know that there is a proposal thought about, discussed, comment made about 50% of the staff at HUD being cut, about the funding being cut. And I believe, anybody can correct me who watches this, I'm gonna have to look it up myself, but FHA being one of the agencies or parts of an agency ended. So these are critical programs that are very much needed, and they won't know the significance and the importance and the need if we don't speak up. Yes. So as Vince said, please use your voice. If you are an advocate, if you are a caregiver, if you are a leader in your community, please do your part in calling, finding out the information, the phone numbers of the legislators in your area, at the federal area, and share that with your community. It is important that we join together and be collaborative partners in making sure that our legislators know how this impacts our daily lives. This is not a hyperbole or anything of that nature. This is real life, and people's real lives are being impacted. So, Vince, please share your final words with the audience.
But first of all, I want to say thank you for allowing me to come on to your program. I think programs such as this can help to get the word out about what's going on and to educate and inform and empower people. And that is what we want to do, is to equip and empower people to enforce and protect their rights. And everybody is somebody in America, and we have laws on the books to help when folks try to not allow folks to be who they can be, who they're supposed to be. And so we're going to continue this fight as long as we can. And again, I appreciate you for having me on here, and I look forward to maybe coming on down the road to share some more additional information.
Thank you, Vince. I truly appreciate you. And you know what? One more thing. You mentioned Coleman Facts. Is it just Relman now? Whatever. The law firm that you mentioned, Relman.
Yeah, Relman and Colfax. Yes.
And Colfax. Thank you so much for that correct name. But I must say, knowing about the water case, I had to come to DC 5 times as a part of the certification process to be a investigator, for fair housing, and as a part of the Fair Housing Assistance Program. I helped to develop it for the city of Canton. So I came here 5 times. But on one of my trips, I took a special trip to Relman to purchase this DVD that was available about the water case. And so I just, again, want to thank you for your work. Thank you for accepting your calling to do this work. Crazy. And for your passion and just your connection to the community, because it is so needed. And at the same time, knowing that you understand the importance of mental health and that you stay grounded in this fight. So thank you for your service. Thank you for your servant leadership. And I truly appreciate you joining me tonight.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And that concludes our episode of Mental Wealth Wednesday. Thank you for joining. Please like and share. Please make comments. We'll also post information about how you can reach Vince and other organizations that are focused on fair housing rights throughout the country. Thank you. All right. I had to end it on Instagram too.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Vince. I'm so glad we went on ahead and went through this, because I was like feeling some kind of way in that car. I was like, that. I guess they got me all hyped up having that security down there.
You had to come home and at least
decompress for a second. Yeah. You're right.
Listen, with my schedule in life, I fully know that decompression is an important part of just getting your head. Because my guys wanted to go work out, and I was like, I can squeeze in an hour right quick. Then I finally said, you know what? I'm not going to try to do everything. I will work out tomorrow. I already worked out earlier today, but I like to, if I can, get an extra one in. But it's no. So I'm glad I didn't try to smash a lot, because I know sometimes they don't